This title on the design argument is an unusual one. Usually you have to write about the arguments and the strengths in part 1, sometimes the strengths and the weaknesses in part 1, but it's unusual to be asked for just the weaknesses in part 1. But it's important to prepare for it just in case. It means you need to know your Hume and your Dawkins very, very well, and it may even be worth looking into philosophers like Mill and Kant, who we haven't done much on. So what could you put in this essay? I would begin with a very short paragraph just summarising the argument. I'd make it a short paragraph and pack in terminology. Remember, terminology earns you marks. Don't waffle in your first paragraph. So you could say it's an a posteriori argument. It's based on empirical evidence. Evidence from the natural world. It's teleological because it's based on a goal in nature, in the natural world. One of the earliest forms of the argument was from Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. He says things which lack intelligence act as if they are intelligent. So things which lack intelligence act as if they are intelligent. So for Aquinas, it's almost as if the natural world has an intelligence built into it, and that suggests that there is a designer. This argument was later developed in analogical form by philosophers like William Paley in the time of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. Now, moving to the main point. Hume was one of the main critics of the argument, and he develops his arguments in his dialogues concerning natural religion. And this is in the form of a dialogue between two characters, Philo and Cleanthes. Philo in particular criticises the argument, and this corresponds mostly to Hume's views, we think. Now, Hume questions whether the analogy with a watch that Paley makes really works. Paley, using examples like the eye, compares things like the eye to machines and says, using that analogy to suggest that maybe there is a designer behind teleological systems in the universe like the eye. Now, Hume points out that the world isn't totally machine-like. In some ways it would be just much more natural to compare it to a vegetable, something like a carrot. The world is much more likely, he says, to be due to generation or vegetation, something that grows. Vegetables also have the features of harmony, complexity, order, purpose. Why not compare the world to a vegetable? We don't have to compare it to a machine. Hume also talks about cause and effect. He says, you can't really know anything about the cause of something when all we've seen is the effect. If we only know the effect that we can see around us, the evidence of order and purpose, we know very little about the cause. We've never seen worlds being made before. Our knowledge therefore is very limited on what might have caused the apparent design in this world. He says, from observing the growth of a hair, can we learn anything about the generation of a man or the growth of a man? So what he's trying to say here is if all you've seen is something very small and limited, you can't really make a judgment about something on a much grander scale. He carries on in a similar vein. He then says, well, even if there was design in the universe, how would we know this was God? Certainly not the God of monotheism. He says, well, it could just be the first rude essay of an infant deity. It could be some minor god who's given it a go and then thrown it away, particularly given what a poor design this universe is. And we certainly can't be sure it's a good design because we've got nothing to compare it to. How do you know it's a single god even? It could be a whole team of gods. Things in this universe that are designed are usually designed by a whole team. Why do we assume there's a single god behind the universe? So for Hume, there's no guarantee that there's a single God, so Paley's attempt to prove the existence of a single God fails. Now, another weakness of the design argument is that there seem to be alternative explanations for apparent design in the world. Even if we accept that some features of the world look designed, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a designer behind them. Natural selection, as put forward by Darwin in Origin of the Species, seems to provide a better explanation. Dawkins explains how the eye seems miraculous to come about in one big step, but in lots of small steps over millions of years, it's not so amazing. This process has come about through random genetic mutations. It's certainly not a process guided by God. It's, as Dawkins put it, it's a blind, unconscious and automatic process. Dawkins here is rejecting the idea that there is a God behind the process of evolution. For him, evolution really is a challenge to the idea of design. Now, if you want to be more advanced, you could put forward ideas from Kant. Kant, in the 18th century, in the Critique of Pure Reason, argues that the idea that design is not necessarily built into the fabric of the universe. Perhaps design is really just to do with the way that we perceive the world. We impose order on the universe. Order isn't there independently of us. If that's true, then that would throw a doubt on whether the design argument can really provide solid evidence for God. Kant goes on to say that we should deny knowledge to make way for faith. For him, knowledge can only come from the senses. We would need faith to go beyond. But finally, John Stuart Mill pointed out that in his book on nature, that if there was a God, then it would be very unlikely that this was a benevolent God, and this is a real weakness of the argument. He says, nearly all the things which men are hanged and imprisoned for are nature's everyday occurrences. Surely, when you look at the world around, you see in the animal kingdom, animals behave in a way that we would see was immoral if we were going to judge them in that way. And certainly, if there's a God responsible for designing the natural world, then it's hard to see how God could be seen as omnibenevolent. Now this takes us to part two. Why do people persist in believing in the design argument, particularly in the strength of the design argument? Now, I would begin by pointing out that the criticisms can be replied to. Firstly, Hume's team of gods argument isn't necessarily strong. You could bring in Occam's razor there, which suggests that a single explanation is always simpler than a more complicated explanation. Maybe a single God is more rational because it's simpler. So there are ways of getting round Hume. And also evolution. Philosophers like Tennant have pointed out that the anthropic principle can help us to get round evolution. We've got to think about why the process of evolution began, how it's worked so for human life to come about. And Tennant is pointing out that you would need some designer to guide evolution and even to fix the conditions of the Big Bang so evolution worked properly. Then, to add to that, point two would be that the strengths of the argument are significant. There is a range of modern scientific examples to support the argument. L. Stafford Beatty has talked about the helium atom. The structure of that is just right, so there is the right amount of hydrogen and helium, so there's enough water for humans to live. Michael Behe has talked about the flagellum, the bacterial flagellum, and how that couldn't have evolved. He says it's irreducibly complex. So there are significant strengths of the argument, and this enables some modern philosophers, to carry on believing in the design argument. That said, not all agree. It is possible still to apply the old criticisms to modern versions. Some would argue that the universe hasn't been evolved just for us to exist, so that the anthropic version could be challenged in that way, that we have evolved to fit the conditions of the universe. And so the debate will carry on. Modern philosophers are divided on whether design can point to the existence of a designer God.